Oh yeah, we're gonna talk about it. The GB Racer. Oh yeah. I know you guys have been waiting on this one, so here we go. We're gonna be talking about the Granvilles and about the GB itself. Now, real quick, Zantford Granville, known as Granny, was the eldest of 5 brothers, and he started an airplane company, GB, Granville Brothers, and they made light sport aircraft that were actually quite stable and very popular. But unfortunately, when the Depression hit, it didn't look like the company was going to survive. So they said, you know what? These national air races, even though the Depression's on, they still have serious prize money available. If we can win that, we can keep the business going. They designed a very minimalist airplane, which would become known as the GB Model Z. Now, they brought on Bob Hall, who would later go on to fame designing aircraft for the Navy. But they designed and built this airplane in 8 weeks. Now, there's too much to tell you about the interesting person that was Zantford Granville and that company. So I'm going to put a link below to a couple of really good documentaries about them. So we're just going to stay focused on the race planes. So the GB Model Z comes out, goes into the 1931 Thompson Trophy race, where it's going to compete against Jimmy Doolittle in the Laird Super Solution. Now, again, Doolittle was the plane, he had the plane to beat, the Laird Super Solution, but there was a problem in the Doolittle camp that the Granville brothers, the GBs, are going to take advantage of. Doolittle had just flown the Super Solution in the Bendix race, which ended in Cleveland, where the national air races were going to take place right afterwards. But the engine that they had used in the Bendix race was not the engine they were going to use in the Thompson race. Remember, normally the Bendix race, since it was a cross-country race, it was more about a combination of speed, navigation, and fuel economy. Whereas the trophy race, the Thompson Trophy race, was around pylons, where it was okay to have more power and guzzle more gas because it was only about a 100-mile race. So they had this big geared engine they were going to put on the Super Solution when it got to Cleveland. And they did. And Doolittle tested it out, and that's when the airplane just couldn't handle the torque, and the airframe started twisting and flexing. They couldn't trim it out, so they had to put the smaller engine back on that they had just used in the Bendix race. But Doolittle had run the heck out of that engine. He had to abuse it to win. So the engine was not in the greatest shape, and sure enough, around the 7th or 8th lap, it started having problems, and Doolittle had to drop out, and the Granville brothers Model Z was able to win the race. Now, they very well could have won the race regardless. Doolittle was having trouble keeping up with it, which is probably one of the reasons he ran the engine out. But what I wanted to make sure was clear was that had Doolittle's airplane stayed in the race and not had the engine problems, the Granville brothers may not have enjoyed quite as much success as they had, but it worked out the way it worked out. Now, one thing to understand about the Model Z is that even though it was a minimalist airplane, the Granville brothers had very little money to build it with. So they started the Springfield Air Racing Association, which is why you see on the cowling of the big GBR1 and R2, you see the dice in between and the 711 between them, it says Sarah. That's not the name of a girl, that's the Springfield Air Racing Association. And it's on both the R1 and the R2. The portly shape of the R1 and R2 is by no means arbitrary. Like a lot of people, I used to just think that it was shaped like this because they just had a big engine and strapped a fuselage to it. But the fuselage is actually wider than the engine. And it turns out that Granny and Bob Hall were staying on top of all the trends in aviation, and there was a theory about the teardrop shape providing the most aerodynamic shape. They actually built a 1/10 scale mahogany model and took it to New York University to a wind tunnel. And apparently the perfect teardrop shape is roughly 3.5 to 1, 3 to 1, depending on who you ask. And they got a lot of wind tunnel data on it, and the same for the wing and everything else, and they were optimizing with the elliptic wing. Nothing on the airplane, despite its odd appearance, nothing on the airplane was by chance. Everything was designed for a reason. And the R1 and the R2 were a little bit different. The R1 was rolling off first, and they were going to put an 800 horsepower engine on it, and it was going to be the pylon racer, and it was going to carry a little over 100 gallons of fuel. And the R2 was going to have a smaller 535 horsepower engine on it and bigger gas tanks for cross-country flying. So the R2 with the smaller engine had a slightly more tapered cowling. The R1 has a slightly more blunt cowling, and everything, including the aerodynamic cooling, the cowling, all of this was all worked out in advance. So Russ Boardman was going to fly the thing, and the very first GB that rolled out had the bob tail on it. It was aerodynamically designed that way. Boardman flew it. He was probably a little intimidated by it when he saw it didn't really have a tail on it, but he flew it from where it was built over to Bowles Field nearby where they were going to do the finishing touches, and he said, yeah, we need a little more rudder. And one of the odd things about the airplane is how thick the rudder is at the base, but that was also aerodynamically proven to be a good way to have more rudder control at low speed while not having it be too oversensitive at speed. So again, nothing was by chance. And so they added this little bit of tail to it to make it a little bit, give the rudder a little more authority. Boardman was supposed to go over and test fly the airplane again, and apparently he had a tendency to yank airplanes off the ground and pull them up into steep climbs, and flying the rather benign GB Sporty model, he took off and pulled it up too steep, managed to stall it, and went into the trees and put himself in a hospital. So now the Granville brothers did not have a pilot. Well, it just so happens about this same time, Jimmy Doolittle, realizing how much competition, he and Matty Laird realized how much competition the GB was going to be, so they had designed the new super solution with a retracting landing gear. But Doolittle was test flying the plane, he couldn't get the gear to come down, he had to belly land it, so now he didn't have a plane. Well, the Granville brothers needed a pilot, and Doolittle needed a plane, so there was a match made in heaven. When Doolittle went out to look at the GB, the first time he saw it, he spent apparently about an hour asking them questions about it. And they gassed it up, and he was going to test fly it, and Cleveland races were approaching, so he hopped in the airplane, took off, and they said he just headed west. And they were like, where's he going? He's coming back, right? 2 hours later, they get a telegram, landed in Cleveland, okay, Jim. Different times. The situation was set up so that for the 1932 Thompson Trophy race, Doolittle was there, and if you see him in the archival footage, you'll see he keeps wiping his nose. He was fighting off a pretty bad bout of hay fever. Well, they also brought over the R2 with the smaller engine to be in the same race. And the R2 is being flown by Lee Gelbeck. And so Doolittle flies in the 1932 Thompson race, pylon race in Cleveland, in the R1 with the big engine, and just mops the floor. I mean, the real race was for second place. And I think his average speed was over 250 miles an hour. He also goes for the Shell Speed Dash while he's there, because right now the French were in possession of the trophy for the fastest land plane, or the record. And he hit clocked official speed of 296 miles an hour. So the American now holds the title for the fastest land plane. And he made himself a fair amount of money doing this too. And of course now the Granville brothers, and by the way, Gelbeck in the smaller engine GB managed to place 5th, even though he had to fight it out against the Waddell Williams racers, and Bob Hall had gone off and started his own company who'd helped design the GB. He designed the Bulldog. So, I mean, it was respectable placing. Now, when 1933 rolls around, Jimmy Doolittle's retired from air racing. So Russ Boardman is going to take the R1 to Los Angeles for the National Air Races are going to be held there. And then he's a young pilot named Russell Thaw is going to fly the R2. Now, the airplanes had undergone a lot of modification. The R2, which had the smaller engine, inherited the 740 horsepower engine from the R1. So it now had big gas tanks and a big engine. The R1, which had the bigger 740 horsepower engine, now had a 1,000 horsepower engine, but it also had a new set of wings that had flaps and about another 34 feet of wing area and a slightly thicker airfoil to make it better as a pylon racer. So the airplanes were fairly different. Well, since Thaw's R2 had a bigger fuel tank, he was actually scheduled for a fuel stop further away than Indianapolis. Whereas Boardman, now with his big engine, had to stop in Indianapolis to get fuel. But Thaw saw that the airplane was burning more fuel than they'd expected, so he went ahead and landed in Indianapolis also. And this is where things really started to take a turn for the GBs. When Thaw landed, he landed fine. But the GBs, when they had modified the wings and everything and started doing a lot of modifications to them, they had quit hand making their own parts and started using some off-the-shelf commercial parts, and the landing gear struts were commercially made product. When he stopped and turned around to go back to refuel, one of the struts broke and the landing gear collapsed and dinged up the wingtip. So they had to limp the airplane over to a hangar to try and get it fixed. While Thaw was trying to get this arranged, Boardman came in the R1, landed to refuel. After he had refueled, he took off, and just like he'd done in the other one, his propensity for pulling the airplane up steep on takeoff caught off with him, and according to witnesses, he pulled it up and it just stalled and rolled on it. It could have been a torque roll, but the point is that he lost control of the airplane on takeoff, crashed, and he was killed. Thaw, seeing this, the young pilot in the R2, just gave up on the GB, so neither of the GBs made the race. So this means that in a matter of just 20 minutes, the Granville brothers had lost 2 planes and a pilot. So in the aftermath of this, the R2 is taken back to Springfield where it's repaired. And Jimmy Hazelip is learning to fly the airplane now, and he's a great race pilot, but on his 3rd landing attempt, the plane started to float on him, and so he tried to side slip it a little bit, which the GB just wasn't a plane you could do to get away with that with, and it stalled and he crashed, and he wasn't hurt, but the airplane rolled and was just torn to pieces. And of course it was built like a tank, which is one of the reasons the only real injuries he had were bruises from his safety harness. But that put the R2 out of business. So after this, the Granville brothers took the remnants of both airplanes and made a hybrid, which some people call the long-tail racer. They put a plug in behind the cockpit, added about 18 inches of the fuselage length. They were using the fuselage from the R1 and the wings from the R2. And this, I believe, was an earlier set of wings. And that airplane was Well, the name says it all. It was called IF, or intestinal fortitude. So it was a handful to fly. And unfortunately, after the crash, it was decided that by Sarah Springfield Air Racing Association that they didn't really want to keep funding the GBs. So Sarah pulls out, and now the Granville brothers are left with this modified airplane, and not really sure what to do with it. And a guy named Cecil Allen bought it, and he actually had it rebuilt. And one of the things he had done was he had additional fuel tanks added to it after the center of gravity. Now, when the Granvilles and their design team found out about this, they were absolutely, no, don't do that. The airplane will be uncontrollable, it'll have an aft CG. But Allen fueled the plane up, got it heavy on fuel, tried to take off, and it crashed, and he was killed. And that pretty much ended the GB race plane line. It really, the GBs only had a few years of racing, but they established one heck of a legacy. Now, it's not really fair to take what happened with the Cecil Allen crash and hold that against the GB, because he was told not to do that. So the airplane has held an extremely romantic place in people's hearts. You know, it's the naughty girl, you know, with the bad reputation. But a lot of people have really wanted to fly the GB, I guess, for the challenge, and some people have rebuilt copies of it. Steve Wolf built one for Delmar Benjamin, and it flew for 10 or 11 years on the air show circuit without incident. It's in Kermit Weeks Museum right now. I believe it was right here in Florida. A replica of the GB Model Z was made, and Kermit's got that one also, and they flew it, and it's still around. So if you fly the airplane the way you're supposed to, and you have the skills to do it, it will perform for you. Now, we can't talk about the GB without talking about the Lowell Bales crash and what happened to the GBZ. Well, Lowell Bales, of course, it's on film. The wing separates while he's making a low pass at high speed, going for a world record. Now, he had actually possibly set the world record before, but on the second, you had to do 2 runs, and on the second run, the timing equipment broke. So in late in the year, in foul weather, they're going to go out and try again. Bales is making a pass, and unfortunately this arcane regulation that high-speed passes need to be made below 150 feet, which is something that was held over from when airplanes were just motorized box kites. This meant he was down in the turbulence, and of course the wing separates and it rolls about 4 times before it hits the ground. He's killed instantly, his body's thrown from the wreckage. So what happened? Now there are 4 basic theories. The first one, Granny Granville was convinced that the fuel cap came off, went through the windshield, hit him in the face, blinded him. He would have accidentally, just out of reaction, jerked the controls. That would impose a load on the wings. One of them would have let go. As a result, in fact, the later GBs had the gas cap inside the cockpit. The other theory was that the airplane had suffered some probably stress fractures or cracks somewhere in the airframe and the wing that were undetected, possibly through all the previous high-speed runs, bouncing around in all the turbulence, and getting banged around that turbulence made it fail. The third one, which I believe is championed by Kermit Weeks, who only flying GBs, to my knowledge. I think there are a couple other replicas out there, but he's flown the Z, and he had the ailerons professionally tested and found out that when you get to high speed, you start to get flutter. And that would, of course, could have set up a vibration that caused the wing to fail. And the fourth one is basically a combination. There was probably some stress damage to the airplane exacerbated by flutter, and then you throw in the high speed, the high stress on the airframe, and then add that turbulence, all of them combined for the wing to separate. I'm not really sure which one it was. It could have been any or all of the above. But the point is, it did fail and he was killed. I don't think it was necessarily an inherent flaw in the design, but they may have pushed the airframe a little harder than they should have. So you get into that Is that really a fault of the design, or is that a fault of them pushing the airplane too hard, or is it a fault of them not detecting previous damage? Hard to say. But Jimmy Doolittle actually thought the world of the GB racers. He wrote a real nice letter to Granny Granville after he won the Thompson in it. And of course, he's Jimmy Doolittle. Now, he also understood, as everyone did, this was an airplane strictly for the skilled professional race pilot. One report I read said that the airplane had to come in at 140 miles an hour and touch wheels at 120. Any slower, you risked aileron reversal. Any faster, it would float on you. So it required real precision, real skill to fly. It's actually been on the cover of the book, The World's Worst Airplanes. I'm not really sure it should be there because I don't think it's one of the worst. Essentially, the GBs were what 30 years later they would start calling X-planes. This was sort of the X1, X1A, X2 of its day. Were they bad aircraft? Of course not. They were research aircraft. The GB was a combination, race plane and research aircraft all in one. That's a lot to ask of an airplane designed by people on paper with pencils and drafting tools and some limited wind tunnel capacity. I mean, when you get right down to it, the argument could be made it's one of the most incredible machines ever built when you look at the entire totality of the circumstances. Now, was this ever going to be a fighter plane for the military? No, of course not. You put a bunch of second lieutenants in these things and you're just going to have GB parts distribution all over the country. But then again, they didn't put 200-hour pilots in the cockpit of X-planes either. So this was an airplane where the pilot really made all of the difference. But it is not fair to call it one of the worst airplanes ever made. I just don't, personally, I don't think that's fair. I might go to say it in some ways is one of the greatest airplanes ever made because it did what it was designed to do. And don't forget that a lot of the other Granville aircraft had a reputation for reliability and stability. And some of their side-by-side seated trainers were some of the first airplanes set up that way and were extremely popular. So, no, I think it's an incredible little airplane that, unfortunately, just given the day in which it lived, the things that happened were going to happen. And it's thanks to airplanes like this that we were able to move forward and advance aviation. But there's a thing called tombstone technology, and sadly, there's a reason none of these originals are still around. But we owe a debt of gratitude to all the people who did fly them, who did build them and design them, and pushed aviation forward. Well, that's enough of my preaching for now. I will see you guys when I get back from work. I hope you enjoy this last little episode for a while of Max's Models After Hours. And when you think about it, this is a 1/48 scale kit, and this is a 1/48 scale kit. I mean, dynamite does come in small packages. See you guys when I get back in a few days, and take care, and meow, model on. You know, if you think about it, this is a 1/48 scale kit. This is a 1/48 scale.